All right, let's jump right into a question that historians have debated for ages. When you think of the American Civil War, what do you picture? Is it the last, brutal clash of old world armies, or is it something else? The terrifying first glimpse of modern industrial warfare.
You know, this conflict sits on this really fascinating and incredibly bloody dividing line. You've got generals who were literally trained using Napoleon's playbook, but on the other hand, they're commanding soldiers armed with technology that would look right at home in the 20th century. So which is it? Where does the Civil War truly belong?
Okay, to really get to the bottom of this, the most obvious place to start is with the hardware, right? The weapons. The war was basically a giant, terrifying proving ground for a whole wave of brand new and very, very deadly military technologies.
And the amount of innovation was just staggering. I mean, we're talking about the first ever naval battle between iron warships, the first use of the Gatling gun, which was basically the great-grandfather of the modern machine gun. And you had repeating rifles everywhere. But for the average guy in the infantry line, the biggest game changer was the new standard issue rifle.
And nothing shows the shock of this new tech better than this. When the Confederate ironclad, the CSS Virginia, steamed into Hampton Roads, well, it was like a spaceship attacking a fleet of old sailing ships. It just obliterated two of the Union's best wooden warships. Cannonballs literally just bounced right off its iron hull.
So the very next day, the Union shows up with its own ironclad, the Monitor, and the two of them fight this legendary duel that changes naval warfare forever. News of this battle shot across the Atlantic, and, as the London Times put it, a single battle between these two strange American ships made the most powerful navy in the world, Britain's Royal Navy, instantly obsolete. Just like that.
But here's the thing. Having cool new weapons is one thing. Knowing what to do with them is something else entirely. The real story here, the real tragedy of the Civil War, isn't just about the technology. It's about the horrific collision between that new tech and some very, very old ideas about how to fight.
Think about it. The generals leading these armies started the war using tactics from 100 years earlier. They were ordering their men to march in tight, shoulder-to-shoulder formations. They were ordering these glorious, sweeping bayonet and cavalry charges. But when you do that against rifles that are accurate at hundreds of yards, it's not glorious. It's a slaughter. It's just suicidal.
And the quiet little revolution that made all this carnage possible was just a small piece of lead, the mini ball. See, before this, rifles were just too slow to load to give to every soldier. The mini ball changed everything. It was small enough to just drop down the barrel quickly, but it had this hollow base that, when you fired, expanded and gripped the grooves inside the barrel. That made the bullet spin.
And that spin was the key. All of a sudden, the effective range of a single infantryman just exploded. We're talking about going from a musket that was barely accurate past 50 yards to a rifle that could reliably hit a target at 400 yards or more. The entire geometry of the battlefield changed. Suddenly, everywhere was a killing zone.
Now, the soldiers on the ground, they figured this out way faster than their generals did. They realized that standing out in the open was just a death sentence. As the famous German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel later wrote when he studied this period, the shovel became just as important as the rifle. Your best bet for survival? Start digging.
And this was a huge innovation that came from the bottom up, born out of pure necessity. It started with individual soldiers just desperately scraping holes in the ground for cover. But pretty soon, that evolved into systematic, organized trench warfare. And it all culminated in the Siege of Petersburg, where you had this 30-mile-long front of complex trenches and fortifications. It was a terrifying preview of what the Western Front would look like in 1916.
So, if the tactics eventually, and brutally, started to catch up with the technology, what was the truly modern part of this war? Well, it was the engine that powered the whole thing, industrialization. This wasn't just a war of armies anymore. It was the first war of factories. And that industrial scale led to an industrial scale of death. The numbers are just staggering. An estimated 660,000 soldiers died. That's more Americans than in every other U.S. conflict combined up to that point. And that level of carnage was only possible because, for the first time, entire national economies were being mobilized for war.
Both sides used mass conscription, pulling men from every walk of life to create these enormous armies, the modern nation in arms. And how did they equip them? With factories. The American system, with its machine tools and interchangeable parts, meant you could mass-produce rifles and cannons.
In the end, it was a war of production. The North's industrial powerhouse could simply outproduce and overwhelm the South.
But you know, the single most important piece of technology in the whole war probably wasn't even a weapon. It was the railroad. For basically all of human history, from Caesar to Napoleon, an army moved at the speed of a walking man, maybe 15 miles a day on a good day. A train could cover that distance in an hour. Suddenly, the strategic speed of war was unimaginably faster.
But even more revolutionary was what railroads did for logistics, for supply. Before the train, you couldn't really field an army much bigger than 80,000 men. It was just physically impossible to feed a larger force with horses and wagons. But railroads, they absolutely shattered that limit. For the first time, it was possible to supply armies of hundreds of thousands, even millions of men in the field for years on end.
So let's recap. The Civil War provided this clear, brutal blueprint for what the future of war was going to look like: industrial scale, trench warfare, and the absolute dominance of defensive firepower. So the big question is, was anyone in the rest of the world paying attention?
And astonishingly, the answer is mostly no. As the great military historian J.F.C. Fuller pointed out, the professional military elites in Europe just sort of looked down their noses at the American conflict. They dismissed the army as a bunch of amateurs, a bunch of volunteers, and they thought the lessons learned were completely irrelevant to proper European warfare.
And that arrogance, that refusal to learn, had absolutely catastrophic consequences. Just 50 years later, those same European armies marched into World War I still believing in the romance of the bayonet charge. They had to relearn all the bloody lessons of the Civil War all over again, and this time, the price was millions upon millions of lives.
It's a pretty sobering thought to end on, isn't it? The Civil War was, in so many ways, the first modern war. But maybe its most important and most tragic lesson is about our own collective failure to learn from the past. It really makes you stop and think, how often does history offer up a clear warning that we just refuse to see?